I think what is lost in all of that is that the purchasing power, Americans don't understand that at the rate we're going, not only is the government going to be not able to do the things you and I just discussed, but the dollar you have today, you're going to need basically to double your income in the next 7 or 8 years because everything's basically going to be double that price. And we're not seeing wage growth or earnings abilities to do that. So again, more and more people are falling behind, not even staying afloat, actually falling behind.
Welcome back to Metals and Miners. I'm its founder and its host, Gary Bohm. Today we have a dynamic discussion lined up, and we're fortunate to have with us once again Peter Grandich. Peter is a 4-decade Wall Street veteran, a portfolio manager, chief market strategist, business, retirement, and estate planner, and all-around media savant. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today.
And I do put my leg pants on one leg at a time like everybody else.
All right, well, let's begin with the Fed and the economy. Has the Fed waited too long to cut rates? And if so, what are you expecting to occur? And on the flip side, what happens if the Fed doesn't cut rates?
Well, I don't think the Fed is as nearly as important or able to do as much as it's done in the past. It's handicapped now because of not only the huge sum where debt has grown to, but the deficits that we're running. And I think privately they would certainly tell the politicians we can't afford to issue another $5 or $10 trillion because of some financial crisis down the road. And while I don't think they say publicly they're politically motivated, I can't imagine that they're still human beings and don't look at things politically as well. And we have two distinctly different potential presidents from an economic standpoint, not getting into anything else at the moment. And so I think their decision would be based also on the political outcome. And that's why, as much as everybody thinks September is a guaranteed cut, I saw our Minnesota Fed chairman talk about he doesn't think they should cut. I still think it's 50-50. I do think a key thing, and it'll be out, I'm sure, by the time you show this interview, they're going to revise the employment numbers this week. And depending on how sharp that is, because, there's magic tricks and then there's the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And I don't know what's different, but that could give a good leadway for them on what they may do. And of course, everybody will be looking for what the Fed chairman has to say here this week out at the big conference. But by and large, I think the Fed is not going to go back to 1 or 2% interest rates and just somehow, Nirvana returns from that. I tell you this much, Gary. I'll tell you what I am greatly concerned about. A, we have an entire generation now of investors and even more importantly, professional advisors who's been weaned on the Fed just acts and everything is okay. And, the put option is some people like to know as it is. But I think the problems are so diverse now compared to any other time that that's not something to count on. So I guess a long-winded answer is I'm not as much concerned about what the Fed may do now as I might have been 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's understandable. So, Peter, in mid-July, U.S. stock market valuations hit the steepest extreme in U.S. financial history. The current level of market valuation, all by itself, in and of itself, places no constraint on further speculation. However, for some, it does show that we're in a historic bubble comparable to 1929, 2000, and even 2022. In your analysis, is the stock market in a historic bubble?
I think what's clear and evident for somebody, as you noted, that's now going into my 5th decade of doing this, I think the complacency, the lack of concern, or at least risk adverse to be prepared potentially for something not so great, is the worst I've ever seen it, both not only among investors, but more importantly, the professional community. I think part of that, Gary, is because a lot of the people who've been doing it have only been doing it since the new millennium, which is 24 years old, but still, there hasn't been any really sustained downtime when suddenly clients don't want to write you a new check and you can buy a bigger car and get a bigger home as a financial advisor. And I think if and when that time comes, they're ill prepared. I view it as they've learned to drive on a one-way street. And I guess you would consider yourself a great driver because you learn to go pretty fast, how to go one way. But I would think if you learned that and then suddenly face two-way traffic, or worse yet, a traffic circle, then that could pose a problem. So as much as I agree with you, historically things are overvalued and all, I have a more of a concern that a normal downturn, if there is to come one, could be accelerated to the downside by lack of experience.
Yeah. So market bubbles tend to end with euphoric highs, like a blow off top. I've been hearing many folks, experts, who believe that we have a last leg here of the current market bubble that still has a lot of room to go, that it's going to blow off in a very mighty, spectacular way. Are you seeing it that way? What are you seeing in your analysis?
So might as well just get a few more of them. I'll get a lot of emails no matter who watches this when I say this from the people that are caught up in this. But I think every market bubble that burst, there was always a poster child that you could look back and say that was the indication and we should have known. For me, that excitement, that period that you're talking about, the insanity of what people are willing to give some value to, it's called Bitcoin. I mean, it doesn't mean that it won't eventually have some roll down the road. But I keep saying that it won't peak until it announces that it cures cancer too, because according to those that own it, it does everything else. Most recently, it was supposed to solve our debt problem and become a reserve currency. And I don't know how anybody could logically speak that in mind about a reserve currency when the volatility of itself doesn't demonstrate any ability to be a reserve currency. But that's where I think that excitement is. Yes, we saw a narrowing. The focus still remains on a small majority of stocks, but I think something like Bitcoin and others like it is what the 21st century marker is to a market that's in a bubble phase.
Peter, there's been a lot of discussion lately about recession. There's been a lot of metrics that people are pointing to that we're headed for recession. Some economic experts are saying we've been in recession as early as last October. You just cited a moment ago some revisions that are going to probably take place in the employment numbers, and some were saying they're as high as 1 million going back to last October. So do you expect us to formally be in recession sometime between now and January, right after the election?
I think we'll see that in the latter part, the middle of next year, when they finally get all the numbers in for this part of the year. I'll tell you what concerns me the most. The bottom 50% of wage earners in the United States now, almost half of them now are using credit cards to pay for just daily usage of necessities: food, gas for the car, rent, electricity. That's unsustainable, especially when 65% of Americans in general are working paycheck to paycheck. So I think the Bidenomics, which you remember how that was touted and what was supposed to be, can only be ruined by Harrisonomics if somehow she wins the presidency. But the bottom line is, I pretty well think for a good part of America, the working class, they've been in a recession. The formal notation of it and actual GDP declining and all that other stuff, maybe either way. But I think for a lot of people, they've been working within a recession-like atmosphere for quite some time already.
You know, I did read this morning about credit card payments and being in default, minimum payments being in default, the highest going back to the great financial crisis.
Yeah, Gary, I really feel for these people. I don't think people understand. My wife and I, we do a lot of work with a few local food banks, and what they'll tell you, and it's all around the country, the amount of people has doubled or tripled, but the level of income of people has gone up a lot. Real working class people, in order to survive, need to go to a food bank. And part of that reason is when you get in that credit card thing. When we were kids, we made fun of guy because there was a guy in our pool hall. He was a loan shark. And I remember his number was 20%. Well, credit card interest rates are well above that. They're the loan sharks of the 21st century. And you can't sustain it. Once you start making minimum payments at a 20 something percent interest rate, they got you for as they did you can never get ahead. And that's a real big issue. And it's a big issue for the working class of Americans. And Gary, this is very important if you don't mind me taking a minute on this.
No, please.
There's a distinct two-class system in this country, not only judicial, but also economically. And the vast majority of people listening to this are in the biggest of section, and that's the real working class. And then there's a very small group at the top of the pyramid. I don't know whether it's the top 1%, 5%, maybe it's even 10 or 12 or 15%. But eventually, the weight of all these people struggling and all are going to pull from them. They are not likely to pull people up. And that's where I think the trouble lies down the road.
Well, I think that's a great point, and it's a great lead-in. So I was going to ask you about some point in the process as the economy's reeling. Well, as those bottom 50% and it grows into 60% and maybe 70%, they're reeling, and the market is also reeling and pops, and things get bad enough. Are you looking for the Fed to come in with their money printers and fiscal stimulus once again? And if so, what will that look like?
Well, like I said earlier, I think they're more challenged now. It was a lot easier to print money when we were in. It's hard to imagine because when I started this business, we didn't even have $1 trillion in debt. Now we have 35 of it. Congressional Budget Office now says in less than 10, it's going to reach 54 trillion.
Yeah.
And interesting about that number, they don't have any major recession within that time frame. So put a recession or two within those, and that could be quite worse. It's very simple now, but it's hard for the typical American to accept this, Gary. At 50 trillion, 5% interest rate, that's a 2.5 trillion interest payment. We've only had 1 year where we had the best year a couple of years ago, where we did 5 trillion, 300 billion in income. So even if that gets boosted up somehow and we get to 6 trillion in income, we're going to look at almost half of our money going to pay interest. Two things can only happen. Governments can only cut expenses and raise taxes. So cut services is a gimme, and taxes going higher. And most Americans aren't prepared for that. And what is going to happen? They're going to cry and they're going to cry. And printing money still could be the choice there. But I don't want to take away from your interview. And if I know you, you may have a question about this. So we'll save it for that. But I think the biggest thing that Americans going to be surprised is about the BRICS and how that's impacting us and how America's going to be on the outside looking out. That's why I don't think the Fed is the big power broker that it once was. But I'll save that if you want to talk about it later.
That's fine. Yeah. So on the printing, though, so, some folks are talking about how during the 2020 pandemic, UBI was being tested by how they were handing out fiscal stimulus to the folks. We've had, multiple decades of them printing to come to the rescue, helicopter money. But with each time that they print, Peter, the growth for per dollar that they print is going down.
Absolutely.
It's going down. So do you see this as a case where if they do print, if they don't print and we run into hardship, how bad do things really get? And then if they do print, is this a case where we enter stagflation completely, where the Fed prints, we experience slower growth because the dollars are just not producing growth anymore at the same level? We have higher inflation on the things that we need, and it's just a very troublesome environment.
Well, this is one thing that I think you can unequivocally say, depending on who wins the presidential election, how impact that would be to your question. If for some reason Harris wins and a similar type administration is run as this for, it'll be a lot easier for that to take place and create that environment. I don't believe Trump, people can say what they want, and I'm not here to defend him or hate him, but I think he brings at least a bit more sanity from a business perspective, and it'd be harder for the Federal Reserve on his watch to do something of that nature. So the political results in November could go a long way in potentially answering that question that you asked. It's not a cop-out. It's just, I think that's an important thing that we should
No,
consider.
that's fair. If that's your viewpoint, that's completely fair. So, staying on the debt issue, you talked about 54 trillion by what was it, 2034?
Yeah, that's their
That's
target.
their target. So from 2021 to 2023, the cost to service the national debt was about 8.7%. And they're saying it's set to rise to 10.9% between this year and 2026. That's the government estimates. Of course, they usually undercut those types of numbers, by the way. What impact will this increase in debt servicing have on the real economy and the average person, where the government is basically siphoning off even more and more of the available resources to just service the exploding debt?
There's two things, as I said earlier, that can be done. Governments can only rely on taxes, and taxes, depending on how much they can raise or take in, services can be provided or not provided. There's two unequivocally certainties that I have at the rate we're going. Whatever we might have been used to from government services, including military, will not be the case 10 years from now if we stay on this trajectory. It's an impossibility. There's no mathematical equation that you could fix and fudge. The second thing, of course, is that the higher the taxes go, we already have a working class that's already working 65% paid paycheck to paycheck. They have no room for higher taxes or less income, and therefore that number will probably dramatically increase and go higher. And then what happens? They do the inevitable of going to the government saying you got to fix this. So it becomes a spiraling more of an impact situation, and that's why I say a good majority of people already have it bad, but they're not absolutely pronouncing about it because they keep turning on Main Street media, who's painting this much better picture. Oh, they must be doing well over there. We're not, but look at them over there. And when it becomes acute and all across the board, that's when people realize that the situation has been a whole lot worse than they've been told.
So the phrase debt doom loop is what's coming to my mind from when you're talking, from what you're saying. So is that what you see here, or have we entered the debt doom loop already?
We've been in it, Gary. We've been in it, but we've been been fortunate enough to get out because, first of all, the United States government doesn't have to fund unfunded liabilities. You and I, as a business owner, whoever may be a business owner, we have to fund our unfunded liabilities. So not only do we have the 35 trillion in debt, but we have all sorts of expectations still of people to be paid Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And many people estimate that the unfunded liabilities is twice as much as the current debt. And these are all things that somehow people still think there's money sitting somewhere that the government just takes it from there to pay them. And that's not the case. So anybody in all these talks, and Trump is doing it too about not charging Social Security and all of that. I tell people this in our planning group, Gary, if you're under 50 right now, don't ever expect to collect a dime from Social Security because by the time you can, they'll have the average age 10 years higher than it is now, and 10% of what you can collect now, you'll be able to collect then.
So the picture that you're painting, for the future, higher taxes, less services, less of a safety net available. Do I have that right?
Yeah, and across the board too, not just in any one region or one particular. Everybody's going to be impacted by that.
So, Peter, the biggest banks in the U.S. now seem to be strategically positioning themselves in preparation for September rate cuts, if they're going to come. Commercial banks' cash dropped by 100 and almost 95 billion in the second quarter of 2024 compared to the first. That constitutes the second largest quarterly drawdown since 2003. They've also been buying a lot of treasuries. What are these movements by the banks telling you? And is the 60-40 portfolio with treasuries back?
I don't think so. In our planning group, I don't even begin to think about the 60-40. I'll tell you what I think has occurred for the interim, meaning in a matter of months. We've probably seen the peak in rates that the 5% that the 10-year got to. Okay, what people don't understand is once the world has totally concluded, and again it gets back to the BRICS, but once the world totally concludes that America is no longer self-sustaining and is in dire need, rates can go sky high even if we're in a deep recession. People don't understand that the key to being a good creditor is people's expectation whether or not you could pay it back. It's not so much what the rate is, but are you going to be able to pay it back? And I think as the foreign groups, as they demonstrated, continue to liquidate and Americans become more responsible to finance our own debt, that's where the big trouble is going to be. And I don't think there's going to be, that 2% inflation, 2% bonds again. Not in my lifetime anyway.
So I'm sure you've heard of this, the Somm rule, named after Claudia Somm, a macroeconomist who worked at the Fed. She states that when the 3-month moving average of the national unemployment rate is a 0.5 percentage point or more above its low over the prior 12 months, we're in the early months of a recession. Recently, the Somm rule was triggered. This has called, when it's triggered, it's called the last 9 recessions. There's been no false signals yet. Is this time going to be different?
No, like I said to you earlier, I really believe for at least 1 out of 2 Americans working are working in a recession environment. We've not seen any real increases in wage ability to earn more money. We see, Gary, I know I'm singing to the choir when I say this, but anybody who believes that inflation is just going up 0.2 or 0.3% is not living in the world that 90% of Americans have to live in. It's such a fraud. It's a farce. I mean, we have business owners that own restaurants and they tell us, Pete, it literally has cost me twice as much in the last 3 to 5 years to buy the simplest item. And it's not going down. It may not be going up 30% every week, but it's still double digit. So I think the inflation you have to understand and appreciate. And I think most people realize that. We just had our home insurance, car insurance, everything's going up 10, 15, 20%. And the government tells us it's going up 0.2%. Listen, I know it's easy to knock them, but in that case, I think it's a total farce, their reporting of inflation. And one of the things that they do, Gary, is every time something gets a little expensive in the basket, they substitute it. So if steak was in there and it went up too much, but if they put in turkey, well, they'll put in turkey. And, that's not a realization. And you know what I can't stand? I can't stand it for 40 years, Gary. This is a pet peeve. When they say inflation, not counting energy and food. Well, who can live without energy and food? Right. That just shows you that they're off the wall to even give me a number that doesn't count. No one can live without those 2 things.
Well, let's stay on inflation for a moment. The latest inflation reading, they're saying for CPI was under 3%. They said it was like 2.9%. Used cars were down something like 11%. People do not buy used cars every month, let alone even every year. It's typically every 3, 4, 5, 6 years that they would even think about buying a car like that. Yet car insurance was down almost 16%. It was up almost 16%. The things that we need, like car insurance, was up big. But the things that we don't really need, that we don't buy that frequently every so many years, those were the things that were down. Can you speak into that?
Yeah, it's the whole farce of the inflation reporting. But listen, this isn't the first administration or the first side of the aisle when in charge that didn't play with the numbers of inflation. But I think what is lost in all of that is that the purchasing power, Americans don't understand that at the rate we're going, not only is the government going to be not able to do the things you and I just discussed, but the dollar you have today, you're going to need basically to double your income in the next 7 or 8 years because everything's basically going to be double that price. And we're not seeing wage growth or earnings abilities to do that. So again, more and more people are falling behind, not even staying afloat, actually falling behind.
So, Peter, let's stay on this topic of people here for a moment. Home Depot reported last week a surprisingly deep and recessionary drop in sales of something to the tune of 3 to 4% down versus 1% expected. The CFO was asked a question, and he stated that the professionals are telling us that for the first time, the customers aren't just deferring because of higher financing costs, they're deferring because of a sense of greater uncertainty in the economy. In your analysis, what is going to come next over the next 6 or 12 months for the consumer?
Yeah, so that's a good point. Home Depot saw an initial boost through the pandemic because people that were home decided they'll fix up their home. they had time to do it. And so Home Depot and those type of companies had results. But I think it's an interesting point that they make and you make, that the people who go to Home Depot, the carpenters, the plumbers, the builders that are normally going out into the community and earning their keep, people are just deferring those type of things because of cost and inability to pay for it. And that always leads to a problem too, because if you keep deferring stuff that needs to be fixed, the problem actually comes greater down the road and all. But I think it's just one of many indications that the Bidenomics, which was just a fabrication of, listen, I've seen other governments and I've seen Republican led governments play a lot of games with numbers, but this was just a farce from day one. This was no rhyme or reason of reality ever in the economics that they were reporting and the real reality of what was happening. And people get used to that. And, one of the things I know that, Gary, is one of the conversations I have from people that come to our planning group from all around the country. One of the comments they always make, well, it must be doing pretty good where you are, because where we are, it's not. And I go, well, we say the same thing about where you are. And it's more across the board than the media at this point in time lets on to be.
So what's the biggest potential black swan that you're most worried about right now?
There's a couple. One is, as I told you, is the complacency. I see, even in where I run our planning group business through, there are young advisors there. I went to give a talk, and I went to talk about the BRICS. And as soon as I said part of my talk is about the BRICS, one advisor leaned over to the other. Is he going to talk about the housing industry? He doesn't even know what the BRICS means. And it's, I think, my personal opinion is that's the black swan in this sense, that America has no real grasp that a bunch of countries that might have used to deal with it in the past and use its money in the past are getting together. This is the simplest way I explain to people, not only to not deal with us anymore, but not even to use our own money and create their own thing. And more are doing that. How is that beneficial to America, as I ask those young advisors and all? And they go, well, I really don't know, because I haven't. I think it's not as bad as you think. I said, well, they had 6. Then they went to 11, 18. Now there's like 50, 70. And by the way, just the other day, 150 of them agreed to use this new system instead of using the SWIFT system or an alternative to the SWIFT system. To me, that's the black swan, that America's political and usefulness and desire to be with us has been lost dramatically around the world, at a time when we here at home are in more trouble now than ever before. So I think the black swan is tied to economics, but it's also tied to the political and social choices that this country has made, and that people around the world aren't in the same mood that they once were when our name of our country came up and to deal with us. But we're not alone in that in the Western world. Canada, I like to joke with my Canadian friends, we would both think that we got the short end of the stick if we traded each other's leaders. So we're not alone, but we're certainly leading the cause to the downside for troubles ahead economically on the world stage.
So there's many experts on this particular topic who will say, well, look, I mean, yes, they're doing this, but it's on the margins. It's not impacting the dollar. The dollar's still strong. It's fantasy to think that these countries who don't even trust each other can knock the dollar off. What do you say to that?
Well, the dollar is strong if you say, well, realistically, for the last year or so, it's gone really nowhere against some key currencies. It's been range bound. But is the dollar really strong when you really compare it to the only known real store of value, and that's gold, because it's priced in dollars. And when you look at it in that regard, it is really, really weak. And I take exception to those people that make that comment. They come from what I call the don't worry, be happy crowd that makes up the regular financial service world. Those people, by the way, as far as I'm concerned, Gary, you can throw them off the Empire State Building. They'll all say the same thing going down. Hey, so far, so good. So I don't expect them to come out with a comment about BRIC until it's too late. But when you tell me that the vast majority of people who control our energy needs, our food needs, military, nuclear, all of that, together as a group, dominate over us, whether or not they can all agree together and all kind of stuff. And we shouldn't be at least concerned. There's not an ounce of concern. Show me anywhere in the major financial institutions' yearly outlooks going into this year where BRICS is even mentioned. I will tell you, we'll see that in 2025 because what they're going to come out with this fall is going to be taken up and noticed stuff. But again, that's why, like I said, is we're so unprepared and we're so complacent at a time when we have nothing compared to the strength that we once had economically, politically, socially around the world.
So what are some of the characteristics that you see coming that the general person, the general investor, the everyday man and woman on the street should be paying attention to, that's going to be a direct result of this BRICS coalescence, against the US dollar? I want to point everyone over to our Substack. It's free. Go to metalsandminers.substack.com. We post free content on the consumer economy, markets, artificial intelligence, individual metals and miners, and every single expert interview that we conduct, just like this one, they're all up there. And when you subscribe, we want to give you a free gift. It's a report that we wrote, and it's based on the important Ray Dalio foundational premise titled, "If you don't own gold, you know neither history nor economics." This free gift is a must-read for everyone on why we all should own gold. So head over to metalsandminers.substack.com, put in your email address to subscribe, and receive the free gift on us. Also, I'm positive that you've enjoyed this conversation with Peter as much as I have. Please let him know. Hit the like and subscribe button and leave a comment below the video.